Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us today for the EI Live K-12 series, which is part of the Columbia Climate School. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the school or joining us for the first time, we're a newly established school at Columbia for transdisciplinary climate research. And we are actually the first new school at Columbia University in over 25 years. We are engaging with all the centers and researchers, and the school incorporates the Earth Institute and over 20 other centers and several hundred people who collaborate across many different departments at the university. What we're hoping to do with these EI Live K-12 sessions is to introduce you to that interdisciplinary work through our scientific experts. These bi-weekly sessions are going to run throughout the semester and into spring as well. And if you would like any additional information about the sessions, feel free to reach out to me. Each session will target a certain topic and will be directed towards a certain age range. So for today, what we'd like you to do is, if you have questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A box. You will not be able to use the chat box. We will keep an eye on that Q&A box throughout the session and address questions at the end of the presentation. Today, we are joined by Melody Braun, a senior staff associate at the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. She has a very interdisciplinary background in earth science, sustainable development, and climate change adaptation. And she's going to talk to us about climate negotiations specifically. And this is very timely as the next COP event is going to be happening very soon. So she's going to give us a little bit of information about how climate negotiations work, the progress that has been achieved so far, and what we should expect in the future. So Melody, whenever you're ready.
Hi, Cassie, thank you. And hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. Let me share my screen really quick. Here we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we're good.
Perfect. So yeah, as Cassie was saying, my name is Melody Braun. I'm French, as you will probably hear from my accent. I've been working at the International Research Institute for Climate and Society for about 7 years now. My role at the IRI is to help with the translation of climate information that is being produced by some of my colleagues, climate scientists, to make it more understandable by practitioners and policymakers who work in different fields. And my background is, as Cassie was saying, multidisciplinary. I studied social science and hard science. And before moving to the US and to New York, I spent 3 years in Bangladesh working on adaptation to climate change over there. And I've been working a lot with Bangladesh since. So I have a very strong focus on that part of the world, but I've also worked in different parts of Africa, and and here I am. So today we're going to talk about the climate negotiations. And I'm assuming that if you're joining this session, you've heard a bit about it, or you're interested in it. You might have been following a bit what's going on with the preparation of the next climate negotiations in Glasgow early November. So we're going to unpack a little bit what those negotiations are, what's going on there, what can we expect, are they enough? And then if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. So first, we'll see, why do we even need climate negotiations, and why do we have so many of them and we keep having them and we still have a climate crisis? So what's going on there? What has been achieved so far? What should we expect next? And also, like I was saying, is it going to be enough, and what can we do? That's a question that I get a lot, so happy to unpack that a little bit with you today. So first, why do we even have climate negotiations? Well, as you know, we have a bit of a climate problem these days. So obviously our activities, human activities like energy, transport, agriculture, tourism, industry, you name it, are responsible for the emission of greenhouse gases. And so I don't know how familiar you are with Greenhouse gases, you might have heard about some of them, like CO2, carbon dioxide, or methane, for example. There are many more. Carbon dioxide is the human-induced greenhouse gas that's the most present in the atmosphere, and methane is the most aggressive one, the one that's trapping the most heat. So as you can see on the graph in the middle, you can see that the amount of greenhouse gases that we emit in the atmosphere have been increasing a lot from 1850 until today. And you can see where it comes from on this graph. So as you see on the graph, you can see that most of the greenhouse gases that we emit are coming from burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And so this is, for example, what we use for energy. This is what we use for transport, etc. And so those are the biggest sources of emission of greenhouse gases. So what happens when we put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere? Again, I don't know how familiar you are with that, but there is this natural phenomenon called the greenhouse effect, which is basically what allows the planet to have a livable climate. Without the greenhouse effect, it would be very, very cold on Earth, and it would be very hard to live on this planet. So the greenhouse effect is what allows the atmosphere to trap some of the heat coming from the sun and from the Earth and keep the climate livable. The problem is when we add more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we're basically trapping more and more heat into the atmosphere. And as a result, the world is getting warmer. So we're seeing a global temperature increase of both the air and the oceans all around the world. So what you can see on the graph here is a typical way of measuring a global temperature increase. So as you see, the temperature is measured in Celsius, degrees Celsius, and it goes from minus 0.6 to 1 degrees. So that could seem a little strange if you're not used to this way of presenting temperature. Basically, what this means is that each year we're comparing the temperature of that specific year with the average temperature on Earth over a long period of time. So in this case, we're looking at 1850 to 2020. And what they did is they looked at the global temperature on Earth over this entire time period. And then for each year, they're comparing the temperature of that year with the average. And if we're below the average, it's going to be a blue line on the graph. And if we're above this average, it's going to be a red line. So as you can see, since approximately the middle of the 20th century, we've been consistently above average. And so that means that the temperature is increasing and increasing and increasing. And every year we have new records and we're further above that global average over that long time period. So as you know, this is not just, it doesn't just translate in warmer temperatures, but it has a lot of cascading impacts all around the world. So it's not just warmer climate everywhere, but it's just more extremes, more changes in the climate systems, in the seasons. It can be colder winter or warmer summers. It can be more extreme rainfall. It can be more drought. It can be stronger tropical cyclones, etc. So, okay, we have this problem, but not everyone has contributed the same. So on this slide, you can see how much each country in the world has contributed to the emission of greenhouse gases. On the left, you can see the map, the entire map. On the right, you just see a few countries, the few countries that have the highest level of emissions. And as you can see, China is by far number one. It has been since the early 2000s, followed by the US, India, and then some more. So this is important because when we talk about reducing our emissions, we obviously need to talk to the countries that are emitting the most. But it's not the only way of looking at the problem. So on this slide, you can see also the ranking of the countries emitting the most, but this time it's not per country, it's per inhabitant. And you can see that the ranking is not exactly the same. That's because China, which was number one before, and India, which was also one of the highest, have a very high number of inhabitants. And so once you divide their emissions at country level by the number of inhabitants, it becomes smaller. So when you look at the greenhouse gas emissions per person, the US is actually number one, followed by Germany and then China. Then you have some more, and India is further down. So you can look at it, like I said, you can look at it different ways. If the atmosphere doesn't really care about the number of people in a specific country, so we do need to work with the countries that are emitting the most to reduce their emissions. But when you think about how to do that, some of it comes down to our lifestyles and how much our lifestyles are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's where it's important to understand the emissions per person. So in the US, our lifestyle is leading to more greenhouse gas emissions than in China, for example. So this is important. I'm flagging this because it's important in the negotiations. Another problem is that, okay, not everyone contributed the same, but also not everyone is impacted the same. So here you can see New York. On the left is New York today. You can see the Bull of Wall Street. You can see a map of Lower Manhattan. And on the right, you can see what it would look like if we had 3.5 degrees Celsius of increase of temperature. And so there are scientists that are working on climate scenarios that are showing what the situation might look like by the end of the century, depending on how much we reduce our emissions. And 3.5 degrees is what we will probably reach at the end of the century if we don't change anything. That would probably lead to a sea level rise of potentially up to 26 feet or almost 8 meters. And so if that were to happen, this is what Lower Manhattan would look like, and the Bull of Wall Street would be completely underwater. So that could seem quite impressive, of course, when you know New York and it's quite emblematic. But if you compare it to what's happening in other countries, this is Bangladesh. So on the left, you can see a map of Bangladesh. Actually, the picture is a picture I took during just a normal intense rainfall event in Bangladesh. So the country is already regularly flooded. People know how to deal with floods. But with 1 or 1.5 meter of sea level rise, so not nearly as much as what we were talking about for Wall Street, you can see on those maps, on the second and the third map, that the southern part of the country will be completely underwater. It's a low-lying area. And so with 1 meter of sea level rise, 15 million people would be affected. And with 1.5, it would be 18 million people. And Bangladesh is a country that's the most densely populated in the world. So there's really just no space for those 18 million people to go to. So they would have to go somewhere else, and where is that, and what are the consequences of that at global level? If you go further, Kiribati is a state that's approximately between Hawaii and Australia. It's a country that is made of 32 small atolls and 1 island that's a little bit more elevated, and it sits on average at 2 meters above sea level right now. So you can imagine that if we had a 26 feet or almost 8 meter of sea level rise, Kiribati would no longer exist. And that's the case of a lot of small island states. So they've actually come together, and they form a group in the United Nations negotiations on climate change, the Small Island Developing States. And that's a group of countries that's really pushing, saying, if we don't do anything, our land will not exist anymore. So we need to really tackle this climate change issue. And we need to also talk about what happens if we lose some of our land, and where would we go? Okay, so with that in mind, we have a problem. Not everyone has contributed the same. Not everyone is affected the same. And to be honest, the people that have contributed the least are affected the most. So we all agree that we have a problem and we need to solve it. But how do we find a global agreement that everyone is on board with, given those inequalities? Well, that's why we have the negotiations, and that's why we're going to the 26th session of negotiations, because it's a really tough problem to solve. So what has been achieved so far? The first time we really started talking about working together to reach a global agreement was in 1992. There was a big conference in Rio in Brazil called the Earth Summit. And that's when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was born, UNFCCC. It's a mouthful, but you will hear a lot about that if you start following the climate negotiations. So this is basically the space in which all the countries in the world are negotiating on climate change. The goal at that point was just to reduce the level of emissions to the level of 1990 by the year 2000. So that was in 1992. They just had a goal up to the year 2000. And there was a recognition already by then that developed countries had really contributed to the problem more than developing countries, and that they had a higher responsibility to address this problem. Now, in 1997, they adopted an additional, they agreed on an additional level of commitments. They adopted the Kyoto Protocol, which you might have heard of. The idea was that the convention itself, with the goal of reducing the emissions by 2000, was okay. It was a good start, but it wasn't really strong enough. So they wanted something that goes beyond the year 2000 and that has stronger emission reduction commitments from the countries. But because of this responsibility of the developed countries that should be higher, the Kyoto Protocol basically only imposes emission reduction goals to developed countries. In other words, every developed country, as defined in the Kyoto Protocol, is given a quota of emissions that they're allowed to reach, but they're not allowed to go beyond the quota. Or technically they can use carbon markets if they need to pollute more than their quota. So that was an attempt to have a system, a treaty that is legally binding, that is basically forcing the developed countries to reduce their emission without having any commitment for the developing world. And in the same year, in 1997, there was a discussion in the US Senate about that, and it's called the Byrd-Hagel resolution. The US Senate unanimously decided that the US didn't really want to be part of that, and so they decided to get out of the Kyoto Protocol. So we'll fast forward to many years later, but basically the goal was that was the first attempt that the world came up with to address this climate problem. And it didn't really work out because first, once the US was out, the US was at that time the biggest polluter, nobody really wanted a strong legally binding system without the biggest polluters being part of it. After the US left, a number of other countries followed. And at some point, the Kyoto Protocol was only covering maybe half of the global emissions. So, a lot of countries started saying, this doesn't really make sense. It's not how we're going to solve the problem. The other issue with it was that with the system of carbon market or carbon trading, basically a country that wanted to emit more than what they were allowed to could just pay for some projects in developing countries and just be allowed additional emissions. And that defeats the purpose because it doesn't really lead to a decrease of emissions. It's quite the opposite. So this didn't work. Fast forward to 2009, where the countries have been discussing for many years to try to find something to replace the Kyoto Protocol. And in Copenhagen, the world really think that this is the year that they're going to agree on the new Kyoto. And it didn't really work. It was a major disappointment. It didn't work because, among other things, there was a massive disagreement between the US and China and India on who should commit in this new treaty. The US was saying, well, the Kyoto Protocol was only targeting the developed countries that have polluted more. But if there's a new treaty, we really think that everyone should have some commitments. On the other hand, China and India, who were considered a developing country in the Kyoto Protocol, were saying, we don't want any form of commitment. And by then, China is actually the #1 emitter of greenhouse gases, but they don't really want strong commitments on climate change. So no consensus could be found. There was no agreement. And that led to a huge disappointment around the world. This was a time when we really started talking more about climate change. There was a lot of hope around Copenhagen, and it was just a huge disappointment. That being said, there was one thing that was positive that came out of it. The developed countries said, yes, we are responsible for most of this problem, and we understand that part of the reason that we're more developed is because we relied on industries that were burning fossil fuels. So we cannot just use that to develop ourselves and then tell the rest of the world that they can't do the same because now we're not allowed to emit greenhouse gas emissions anymore. So we need to provide funding to support clean development in developing countries, and also to help those developing countries to adapt, because as we've seen, they are the ones who are seeing more impacts of climate change. So they committed to provide $100 billion a year to developing countries to support clean development and adaptation. That was a good thing, but we'll come back to that. So yeah, Copenhagen was a big failure. The person who was appointed right after Copenhagen to take on this coordination of the climate negotiations, her name is Christiana Figueres. She's from Costa Rica. She, in her first interview after she took the job, the reporters asked her, will we ever see a global agreement on climate? And her response was, not in my lifetime. So that's just to say how disappointed everyone was after Copenhagen. But fast forward again 6 years later, in 2015, we actually did it. There was a global agreement on climate, which is the Paris Agreement, and I'm sure you've heard about it. So how did that happen? Well, the problem with Kyoto was that it had a lot of rigor. They really wanted to have, strong commitments, but because of that, partly because of that, there was really low participation, and it ended up not making sense because there were not enough countries in it. So with Paris, they did the opposite. There's a really high participation. About 200 countries are in, but it's not as strong and rigorous as the Kyoto Protocol because that was the only way to get that high participation. The goal is to stay below 2 degrees Celsius of increase by the end of the century. If possible, 1.5, because according to a lot of scenarios, that's what would allow small island states to stay above water. And to convince both the US and China and India to be part of it, they had to find a consensus, right? So the Paris Agreement is requiring commitments on emission reductions from every country in the world, which is what the US wanted. But it's letting each country decide how much they want to commit to, which is a compromise for China and India. So each country is just responsible for telling the rest of the world what their commitments will be in documents that are called nationally determined contributions, NDCs. And actually there's a new level, a new round of NDCs that are due now this year. So the countries are just revising these documents every 5 years. And the goal is that every 5 years, they assess their situation, they assess how much they can commit, and they update the NDCs. The Paris Agreement also recognizes adaptation, which was very important. In addition to reducing emissions, we need to have plans to adapt to the climate impacts that we're already seeing. And it's recognizing loss and damage, which is what will be lost, such as land with sea level rise, even if we reduce the emissions and even if we have adaptation strategies. Okay, so now fast forward to this year, and actually to 1 week from now, where we'll have the 26th edition of these climate negotiations in Glasgow in the UK. So what are the main goals this year? Well, first of all, there was an IPCC report that was produced in August. If you're not familiar with that, IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a group of the best scientists working on climate change all around the world. And they come together every 6 years and they produce these reports that are summarizing the best available science. And they tell us where we stand and what's the trajectory that we're on. And so this report basically said that we can still address the climate crisis, but we have to act now. So one of the big goals of COP26 is to increase the level of ambition, is to push countries to put in place policies that will really tackle, reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and really help put us on the right trajectory. There are a number of these new country commitments that have been published, but right now the level of commitment is really still insufficient. We're going to need to reduce approximately by half, reduce our emissions by half by 2030 to stay under 1.5 degrees of increase, and then by 25% to stay under 2 degrees. Another goal is to increase finance. So remember when I said in Copenhagen, the developed countries promised 100 billion a year to developing countries to help with clean development and adaptation. And actually, that amount was never reached. Not a single year did they reach 100 billion. So the developing world is starting being a bit impatient and saying, you know, you've been promising this every year and it's still not coming. Why should we trust anything else you're saying? Fair enough. Also considering that the amount of money that we need to invest to meet the goals to basically stay under 1.5 or 2 degrees are a lot higher than 100 billion a year. So that's something that is really expected in COP26. We really need to see finance commitments from developed countries. Another problem with that money is that the money that has been given is focusing mostly on reducing emissions, but we need at least half of that to focus on adaptation, because the developing world is really facing very strong impacts of climate change already. So they need to be able to adapt to that. And then we need finance on loss and damage. That's a whole other contentious issue. It was recognized in the Paris Agreement, but it was a hard fight between the developing world and the developed countries. And it was added to the Paris Agreement with the condition that it doesn't imply any liability or compensation. That was the condition for the US to be part of the Paris Agreement. So long story short, we have this in the Paris Agreement, but no one really knows what it means and what we're going to do with it. So there are working groups working on the technology that can support loss and damage, and also the finance mechanisms that can help address that. There's something that might be interesting for you guys. It's called Action for Climate Empowerment, or ACE. And that is something that is pushed by the youth groups that are present at COP. One of the, well, basically the mandates, the goal of ACE is that every country in the world has the mandate to educate their population on climate change and empower all members of society to take part to climate actions. And to do that, you need to have systems in place to promote education, training, public awareness, public access to information, public participation, and international cooperation. So the youth groups are really pushing for ACE to be included a bit more concretely at country level. We need specific programs in place on how this is going to be done. We need specific funding in place to do that. So there's a lot of discussion on that, but it's not one of the major agenda items. So it's not easy to really put it at the forefront of the discussions. And then another very central cross-cutting issue that is, I think, being more and more put to the table and finally gaining more and more attention is climate justice. I think in the US in particular, that was a huge discussion in the past years, and it's really something that is being brought to the table more. So it's a cross-cutting issue. We need a more fair and inclusive process in every aspect of the climate negotiations, in every topic that's being discussed in the negotiations, but also in the way countries are negotiating. So that's also something that especially civil society will keep an eye on throughout the process. Just very quickly, if you wonder what it looks like to be at COP, the bottom left is, the top left is what a plenary looks like. I don't know if this year will look like that because of COVID, but that's what a normal COP looks like. So you have, big plenary sessions where delegations from every country in the world are sitting and they're, taking turns to give political statements. The second picture is a smaller type of negotiation where, they have rooms focusing on specific topics. So smaller groups focusing on one specific agenda item of the negotiations, and then civil society and organizations like us can attend and we can't participate, but we can sit in and listen. The third picture is what we call side events. So we are observers at the COP, but we can organize events on topics that we're working on, that we're interested in. So here we're talking about the use of climate information in adaptation and how it can support adaptation. And then the two pictures on the right are examples of demonstrations of civil society. So there are a lot of groups that are coming to COP to really push the governments to have higher ambitions, basically pushing them to be accountable for the promises that they've made. So these are just a few examples of that. And so is it going to be enough? What can we do? Well, as we've seen in the last IPCC report, the time is now. We have time, but the time is now. And we don't really need a new way of negotiating. We don't need a new accord. We don't need, it's not the system that doesn't work. What we need is just higher ambition from every country. The system is in place, but the system alone is not sufficient if the countries are not willing to, put policies in place that will really solve the problem. So what we need is increasing the level of ambition. We have all the technology, we have all the tools. Solar and wind, for example, are becoming cheaper and cheaper. A lot of private sector is investing in cleaner technologies. So for example, these are just a few examples. H&M said they will double their energy efficiency by 2030, so better use of the energy. A lot of the largest companies are now committing to using 100% renewable energies by 2050. Microsoft, for example, has pledged to be carbon negative by 2030, so absorbing more carbon than what they produce. So those are just a few examples. And the countries and the states are stepping up. Even when the US were out of the Paris Agreement, there were several states and private sector in the US that kept coming to COP and saying, we're still in, we're going to still do what it takes at our level. And the general public is more and more engaged. We've seen so many climate strikes, such a strong involvement of the youth all around the world. And this is really critical because even though they're not the ones sitting at the negotiation table, they are the ones holding the companies and the governments accountable. So basically, what we need is higher ambition. I'm going to go quickly on that, but this is just to show you how a number of the big social issues of the past century or 2 centuries were achieved. And so, interracial marriage, prohibition, women's suffrage, abortion, same-sex marriage, recreational marijuana, like none of those we wouldn't have seen any change on any of these topics if we had waited for the government to act on its own. These all came from social movements. It all came from civil society saying, we want to see a change on this. We're coming together for that. So what I say to people who ask, like, why should I do something about it? It's not my responsibility, it's the government's responsibility. What I want to say is I'm very happy that, people who fought for women's suffrage or interracial marriage didn't just expect the government to do it for them. Instead, they just, they stood up and they won. So these are just a few examples of what can be done at your own level. So at the level of a person, a lot of people are saying, what can I do? I'm just such a small part of so many people. I don't go to COP. I don't work on climate. What can I do? Well, in your private and personal life, one of the smallest circles, what you can do is you can learn as much as you can. That's the first thing, education on climate change. You can't do anything if you don't fully understand it. You can donate some money if you have, but time, you can donate your time to try to work on these issues. You can invest in activities that are not polluting, that are not emitting greenhouse gases, like, walk, ride your bike. You can be more careful about your consumption and how your lifestyle is impacting the climate. So, try to consume less or consume better. Try to pay attention to products that are more local, that are more eco-friendly, that, are less packaged maybe. You try to reduce instead of reuse instead of buying new things. Those are small things that you can do at your own level. At the level of social networks, you share learning, teach, persuade, talk to your friends about it, try to bring more people, raise the awareness in your friend circle. At organizational level, it's really about sharing ideas and changing processes. As a group, we can really look at the way things work and identify how we can make this better. At the public level, obviously, when you're older, you can run for a public office. We need to change the laws. You can vote. You should vote. You can protest. Like I said, what we need now is not a new way of negotiating. We have that. We need more ambitions. And the thing is, the people that are responsible for raising ambitions are people that are in power that we vote for, or companies that have money that we basically influence with the way we buy. If we buy from a certain company, we're supporting that company indirectly. So by choosing what you buy, you're influencing the way these companies are making their plans. And then at cultural level, change norms, change systems, share stories, change symbols. So those are just a few examples, but I'm curious to hear about your strategies, what you have in mind, how you think you can be a part of that. I would, if you really want to be, more engaged in all of that, there are a lot of groups, there are a lot of youth groups that are active on climate. There are a lot of programs that are doing climate education. So all of that is supporting what's happening in the negotiations. It's not one or the other. It has to happen in parallel. We need to have all these different components together. So I hope this was useful, and I'm going to stop now, and I'm happy to have a discussion with you and respond to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Melody. That was a great overview and very detailed overview of kind of the history, the context, the science, and what are the issues actually being discussed. I think when we hear negotiations, sometimes we wonder what that actually looks like. So that was really helpful. In the chat, I have put a link to the latest IPCC report. I think it's great. It's also pretty interactive, which I have enjoyed. I've played around with it. There's like an interactive web atlas of some kind where you can also play around with scenarios. And those scenarios are really, really important for this particular context. I think I'm going to start off with a question, and then for anybody else who's here and who would like to ask a question, feel free to use the Q&A box. I'm curious about the legal frameworks that are perhaps in place to enforce. So I was lucky enough to be part of a mock UN climate negotiations activity this summer with high school students. And it was really interesting to see how they interacted with each other. They took on different roles. But one of the biggest questions from the youth perspective is, how do we ensure that this is enforced? What are some potential legal frameworks in place? And I think part of the message was also to younger students and high school students in particular, in terms of things that you can be doing. So as you think about future careers, you're not, it's not necessary that everybody goes and becomes a climate scientist. Some of you are going to become lawyers who are going to probably have a role in enforcing some of these negotiations and agreements. So I'm curious if you could perhaps shed some light on the legal aspects of the negotiations as well.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's actually it's a critical point. So a lot of people are saying that the Paris Agreement was really disappointing because it doesn't have a strong legal enforcement mechanism. So basically, each country is responsible for determining their own goals, in terms of how much they're going to reduce their emissions, what they're going to invest in adaptation, etc. And it's really up to them. And if they don't do what they promise that they will do, there's no real consequence other than public shaming. It's basically very much based on public image and like how it's going to make your country look like if you're not up to speed with what the other countries are doing. So it's a little bit frustrating because yes, it's not as strong as what we would want it to be. But then somebody said, George Monbiot said after the Paris Agreement that it was just it's not enough, but it's the best that we could possibly do. What we've seen with the Kyoto Protocol is that initially we had much higher ambition to have something that was much more, strongly binding with actual consequences if you don't achieve your goals. But then everybody was out because nobody wanted to commit to that. So the Paris Agreement is basically just something that is based on the willingness of countries to react and to take action. What we're seeing is that it is working. It's not sufficient yet, but it is working. So for example, now there are a lot of countries that are coming up with net zero targets. So that's a date in the future by which their country will be net zero. Being net zero means you have mechanisms in place that basically lead the sum of your emissions to be zero. So you reduce your emissions and then you have mechanisms to absorb carbon, like for example, trees absorb carbon. So you have mechanisms in place to absorb carbon dioxide, to store carbon. And when you add the two, it adds up to zero. So now a lot of the countries are saying they're going to be net zero by 2050, 2060. And we see how these announcements are coming one after another, right? So, oh, China just did it. So now, this other country has to do it, etc. So that's basically how it works. Now, the thing is, the role of civil society and youth groups, for example, is to push countries at national level. So push your own government, your own elected officials to have policies in place that can be legally binding. So for example, the US is working on their climate policies, but in each country, basically, the policies that are put in place in one country can be legally binding. It's not going to be legally binding at the level of the COP, but in a country it can be. And that's really where the role of citizens is important.
That's great. And I think that's a really helpful reminder that these are negotiations that might happen at a very with global sort of implications, but that in terms of the work and the enforcement and the hard work that has to be done, that is all sort of within at the country level, at the state, provincial level, at the city levels. And so there's different sort of roles for everybody within all those levels. And I think, you've touched on this a little bit, and with the bit of time that we have left, I don't see questions. We have someone who said great work and great job at communicating this very complex topic. The question is more, I've heard you speak a couple of times about this, and your sort of participation in the negotiations, I think, is really valuable for high school students in particular, because I think it's we think, oh, COP, it's government officials, it's government teams. How do I, as a high school student, how do I get started? And I think your personal journey with the different roles that you've had in the different negotiations would be really interesting as a nice way to wrap up the session. So if you could share a little bit about your personal experiences, how you've participated in past COP events, that would be really valuable.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so basically at COP, you have a lot of different people, different groups that are coming, right? So you have the official delegations of each country that are the ones that are basically doing the actual negotiation. And those are usually government officials, ministers, etc. But then you have a lot of groups that are what we call observers. And that's what the role that I've always played. So when you're an observer, you're representing different parts of civil society. And you're part of an organization that is accredited, so like authorized by the UNFCCC to attend COPs, and you can organize events there and you can attend the negotiations, but you can't intervene in the negotiations. Every now and then they give a slot to the civil society to talk, but you're not really part of the official negotiations. But you can be there, you can talk to people in the corridors, you can organize events, you can organize protests. They have to be authorized, but you can. So there are a lot of ways that you can make your voice heard when you're there. And so my first COP was Copenhagen. The one that I mentioned was a big disappointment. I went there, I was a student. I was a university student, but I went there, full of hope that this was the summit that was going to change the world. And so I was part of, I went with different hats. I was part of Oxfam, so an NGO group. I was also part of another group that was accredited, so I could get inside the conference center. And I went there with my friends because we had a project that we just came up with just together. We wanted to shoot an amateur documentary movie on the expectations of civil society at COP. So we went with a camera, no experience in filming whatsoever, and we just interviewed a lot of people on what their expectations were, and then we produced a movie out of it later on. And so that was just one example, but basically there are a lot of organizations that are giving badges, a lot of organizations that are accredited that can get into the negotiations, that are providing badges for young people. And so, for example, there's a group of young people. It's a youth constituency that is there at every COP. It's a huge group, a huge network of people from different organizations that are really looking at increasing the engagement of the youth in the negotiation. This group is called the Youngo. And so they come from different organizations with different focuses, but they're really trying to increase the engagement of the youth in the different issues. And they're very much on top of every agenda item that's happening at COP. And they are formulating recommendations and formulating opinions on what the youth want to see. On ACE, for example, Action for Climate Empowerment, there's also a very strong youth delegation that is working on that. In the US, for example, they're even formulating recommendations to the US government on how to implement ACE. So basically, if you want to be part of the negotiation process, you want to learn more about COP, the easiest way is to join one of these groups. And within these groups, they will have working groups on specific issues and specific agenda items within the negotiations. And they will walk you through what's being discussed on these specific issues. What do we as youth want to see? How can you share your opinions? How can you contribute to these recommendations? How can you potentially have access to some of the badges that are available? So there are many ways for youth to be involved. Basically what I do when I go to COP. So yeah, initially it was very much as civil society, and I wanted to see more ambition. Now, as part of my job, it's I still have that part of me. I still go because I want to also push for all of that. But it's also that for us, it's a big networking opportunity to talk about what we're doing and to connect what we're doing with the discussions in the negotiations. So a lot of the work that we do on integrating climate information into policies and practice, those are very concrete ways to support developing countries to increase resilience. And so it's very directly related to adaptation. Some of the work that we do on climate insurance, for example, is very directly related to loss and damage. The question of how do we finance or how do we prevent losses and damages in developing countries. Some of the work that we do on education is very directly related to ACE. We're doing a lot of professional trainings that are also something that is part of the Paris Agreement. So basically, our work the rest of the year is mostly in the field and you're working directly with practitioners and researchers and connecting the gap between the scientists and the practitioners. And then when we go to COP, we're connecting all of that with the policies at policy level, with those discussions to make sure that the people that are negotiating have the information in hand that they need to be able to develop policies that are efficient and connected to the reality on the ground.
Fantastic. I think that's a great sort of area to end. We did have a question, which I think you've sort of addressed, which was really more about youth groups that can help influence the negotiation. ACE is a big one. And are there others that you think are important for people to check out? Great, you wrote it in the chat. So Youngo, yeah.
The Youngo is the youth constituency. So that is really the network of all the different youth organizations that are working at on the COP.
Great. All right, fantastic. Is there anything else you would like to say to the high school students who might be watching this or tuning in later?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that no matter what no matter what your career path will look like, you should probably have to include climate one way or another. And Absolutely. To work on climate, you don't need to be a climate scientist. I'm not a climate scientist. And no matter what you're going to work on, there's a link with climate. There are people working on climate and art. There are people working on climate from a science perspective, people working on climate from from a law perspective, from a health perspective. So no matter what you do, it will be related. And I would say whether or not you're planning to work on the politics of climate change, it's always interesting to understand what's going on at COP. You know, what I keep hearing year after year, this will be my 7th or 8th COP. And usually when I come back, since Copenhagen, I haven't been to every one of them, but the first one was 2015. And very often when I come back, people say, another one of those, and we still haven't solved the problem. So what is even happening there? Is there anything happening? There are so many things happening there. Obviously, at that level, it will go slow. There's no other way. We can't expect that it's going to be easy to find an agreement with every single country in the world, considering all the differences that all the inequalities and all the differences that we've talked about. So
Yeah.
I think it's unrealistic to expect that they will solve everything and that it's going to be easy. But it is a necessary part of the solution. It's not the only part of the solution. So the other part of the solution is it has to come from the bottom. It has to come from all of us. And find the things that you're interested in, that you're good at, and how that connects to the climate crisis. There are 100%, there are connections, no matter what your thing is. So yeah, I mean, then it's just about connecting with the right people, getting together. That's how, like I said, I like the slide about social change, because that's what happened. That's how every single social progress that we achieved was achieved. It's with people coming together, with just the willingness to make a change. And yeah, I'm optimistic in that sense.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that very optimistic perspective, and for sharing your experiences and your expertise here. Best of luck at the next COP. And for those who are tuning in, if you have any questions about anything Melody talked about, this will get posted. And if you do have any questions, feel free to let me know. And we hope you are able to join us for another EI Live K-12 session in the future. Thank you again, Melody, and hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.
Thanks to you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Bye.